For 28 years, a sadistic murderer stalked northwest China, preying on women, vanishing into the shadows, and leaving behind scenes so brutal that he was dubbed the Chinese Jack the Ripper. Dozens of victims and countless leads, and yet no answers. Investigators would be haunted for decades by a ghost who always seemed to be one step ahead. And it would take nearly 3 decades and one stroke of DNA luck before the mask of Gao Chengyong finally came off. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you are new here. I hope you're all doing so well. Welcome back to another true crime and makeup episode. Oh yeah. As you know from the video title, the introduction and probably the thumbnail, we are covering the case of Gao Chengyong. He was known as the Chinese Jack the Ripper, and I'm going to tell you all about it today. It's grisly, it's gruesome, it is disturbing and disgusting. This pathetic Weasley loser little man, ugh, the audacity. It invokes a certain kind of rage in me. Now, before we dive in, if you are new here, hi, my name is Anna. I am a certified yapper. One day I decided I'm going to come on the internet, I'm going to yap about true crime, and now I do it twice a week, every single week on a Wednesday and Sunday. So, if true crime is your jam, which if you came across this video, I believe that's because it is, then I highly suggest you subscribe, get the notification bell on, because like I said, I'm here for you twice a week, every single week, and it's free. Any details you need regarding me, myself and I, they can all be found listed in the description down below. But we have an absolute POS to cover today, so without any further rambling and any further ado, let's get into the horrifying, terrifying case of Gao Chengyong. So before we even dive in to these horrific crimes, which by the way, spoiler alert, they are as brutal as they come, first we need to dive into his childhood, the backstory, the villain origin story that all of these pathetic losers seem to have. And when I tell you that this childhood had more red flags than a 2000s MySpace profile, you best believe it. And with that, let's roll back the tape to 1964. So Gao Chengyong, he was born on November the 10th of 1964. He was born in Gansu province in northwest China, and Gansu province at this point was a place of poverty. It wasn't exactly the land of opportunity. It was a very poor region. And when I say poor, I mean most people were working in fields, they were living hand to mouth, constantly praying for a decent harvest so they could harvest crops to eat. Children had so much more to worry about back in that time. It was almost like they had to take on the struggles of their parents because their parents were so outwardly stressed. These children, they didn't have to worry about their Game Boy batteries dying. They had to worry about whether or not their mum and dad could afford to feed them. Now, Gao, he was the eldest son within a farming family, which meant from a very young age, with him being the oldest, everything was dumped on top of him. He was expected to carry so much more responsibility than any child should. Because at this point, if you're the firstborn within rural China, it's not like, oh my god, yes, I'm going to be the golden child, I'm going to be the favourite because I'm the firstborn. It's more like, congratulations, you are free labour. So Gao, he worked on the land, he helped to raise his siblings whilst his mum and dad were busy, and he lived under a suffocating combination of poverty and also parental pressure. The 3 Ps. 3 Ps that we don't want to know. Now, on the surface, outsiders looking in or neighbours from afar, if they were asked about Gao, they would say he was introverted, he was polite, he was friendly enough. But as many, if not all of these true crime cases go, there will always be a neighbour later on who gets questioned about this neighbour, who then says, he seemed like a nice guy, he seemed like a regular guy, but we all know he's not. He is a psycho on the loose, and this guy in this case was Gao Chengyong. Because already underneath this quiet, introverted little farm boy routine was a young boy who was nursing and cradling some of the most violent fantasies you could ever imagine. By his teenage years, Gao was a walking red flag, if not a bunch of walking red flags. Everything about him just set off alarm bells. He had a fascination with violence and, can you believe it, especially toward women. What did we do wrong? He was awkward, socially isolated, he was obsessive. And not only that, but his biggest obsession seemed to be with control and dominance, which sounds all too familiar when we cover these people, let's be honest. And whilst most teenagers are discovering MTV or their celebrity crushes, Gao, he was developing intrusive fantasies with women, blood, pain, suffering, domination, and sexual violence. Now, Gao, he never really seemed to date throughout his high school years into his early adolescence. He was never really able to form healthy bonds with women, and shock horror, just because he can't emotionally connect with a woman on a deeper level, he will choose to hunt them later in life. Not only this, but Gao, he started to develop an unhealthy obsession with knives, and these wouldn't be farming knives or kitchen knives. He was more obsessed with a blade, more within the surgical instrument family. Good cutting instruments, ones that could cut deep through, flesh? Human flesh? And he was carrying these knives the way other teenagers were carrying around their Walkmans, okay? The knife was his Walkman. He went nowhere without it. If he left home and realised that his knife was still on the kitchen counter, he would run home. He would sprint, he would retrieve his knife, and then off he would go. Now, the thing is, when you are younger and you live within farming towns, it's not really common for people to question why a young farm boy would be carrying around a blade. It's weird, but it's not unheard of. Because farming, it's all about practicality, and having a blade, practical? Sure. Terrifying in hindsight? Abso-friggin-lutely. When it came to Gao's education, it was pretty standard for that time in rural China. I mean, was he a great student? No. Was he the most intelligent? Definitely not. Now, he got through middle school, he moved around doing some vocational work, and like many other young men at this time, he just moved around doing odd jobs. When teachers were asked about his academic level, they were like, he's not intelligent, but he wasn't failing his classes. He was, just unremarkable. That is one word that describes this man so greatly in every aspect of his life. Looks, personality, work ethic, workability, everything unremarkable. Another word that was used by many who described Gao throughout his life was invisible. He was just invisible to most people, invisible to women, invisible to people that he should have been friends with. And this invisibility that he had harboured and manifested, this would become his mask. This allowed him to navigate his way through his crimes undetected. Now, before we dive into any of the murders that took place in that escalation into violence, let's take a step back, because as we all know, and I'm sure we can all agree, Gao didn't fall out the womb holding a knife in one hand and an alibi in the other. He would spend years playing this fantasy game of normalcy. He would create a life for himself at this point that seemed to be box standard, that seemed to be the done thing, the wife, the children, the business. And sometimes in these cases, that's the most terrifying aspect. We're not talking about some guy that lives in a cave and he's like cackling away to himself and sharpening his knives. He looks like a family man. He looks like a local businessman. He's polite enough. He's unremarkable. He's like that neighbour in your street that you wave to whenever you see them. But if someone asked you their name, you'd be like, John? Patrick? I don't know. And that was Gao. He was forgettable, but he was almost forgettable on purpose. He didn't want you to remember him. Because if you did, you might be able to detect what he was up to. And honestly, this is something that can make these people 10 times more terrifying than they already are. So Gao, somehow, he is able to find himself a wife, which, I know, with that face and that haircut, I'm not sure either, but someone was attracted to it somehow. So he has his wife, he then has his kids, and at some point later on, he would open his own little business, which was a little corner shop, a little convenience store. And again, outsider looking in, this all seems fairly normal. A normal, regular family growing up in the 80s and 90s, husband working, wife raising the kids, and their little corner business. Normal, right? Let me tell you, there is nothing normal about this, and we're going to dive into it very, very soon, but all I can say is strap in, get ready, and grab a blanket, because this guy, he's terrifying, and he will put you off shop owners for life. So Gao, he is wearing this mask of family man, devoted to his wife, devoted to his kids. But deep inside his mind, he was elsewhere. And let me tell you, it wasn't at Fluffy Bunny Ridge or Candyland. This man was fantasizing about injuring women, about subduing women, having his way with them, and then murdering them in one of the most brutal fashions. Gao didn't fantasize about a better life for his family. He didn't fantasize about providing for his wife or his kids. That was the last thing on his mind. All he could think about was control, blood, violence, pain, suffering, and fantasize about women who didn't even know his name. So of course, as we know, Gao has his little convenience store on the corner. It's almost like a small grocery shop, but you can also pick up odd bits here and there. People would come in for cigarettes, alcohol, snacks, maybe a drink. And every person that came into this shop would describe Gao in the same way. Polite, friendly, kind enough, reserved, quite quiet, but overall, a nice, normal, unremarkable guy. He was known as the kind of guy that didn't bother anyone. He didn't have an issue with anyone, or at least none that anyone knew of. But this whole time, the whole time that he is greeting customers, that money is exchanging hands, that he is talking about the weather, he is observing, watching and cataloguing every single woman that walks in and out of his shop. They weren't customers to him. They were potential prey. And it's this double life again. Cashier by day, predator by night. And it's just so freaking disturbing. People are going in, getting their bread, their milk, maybe some noodles for this guy, thinking that he's just this nice, normal, polite guy. And he is literally picturing their heads on sticks. Like I said, it really puts me off quiet corner shops. And I just need to stress again, this guy, he was completely invisible. People, they didn't get to know his name. They might know him as the kind, friendly guy from the shop, but they don't know him personally as Gao. There was nothing flashy about this man. There was also nothing suspicious about this man. Nothing that makes you look at him and think, I bet he is hiding some sadistic, crazy murder fantasies. And when we look back into the case, we can see the cracks, we can see the obsession with knives, the obsession with hurting women, the isolation, treating women like objects, we can see it all. But people at that point couldn't, because Gao would use his invisibility like it was a superpower. Gao very quickly learned that he could mould himself to be whoever people wanted him to be. To his wife, he's a doting husband. To his kids, he's a loving father. To the locals in the neighbourhood, he's a nice shopkeeper. But to himself, his true self, he was a monster lurking beneath the surface, just waiting for that perfect opportunity. As we know, Gao, he spent a lot of his life waiting on the perfect time to strike, and that perfect time to him would come in 1988. This was the day that Gao stopped fantasizing and started making these fantasies a reality. Now, before we dive into the victims in today's case, I just want to put out a quick warning. Obviously, usually I come fully packed with the details, first name, last name, their whole origin story themselves. I love to do that for the victims to ensure that I'm humanising them as much as possible, for people to know that they're not just a story. They are real people who suffered a horrific end, but more than that, they were someone who was loved, who was cherished, who is missed every single day. And the same goes for the victims in this case today. However, due to the laws within China, they have restricted quite a lot of the information that has been released about the victims, so I will be referring to them by their surnames, and I in no way mean that disrespectfully. I'm trying to respect what's been put out there. I will give as much detail as I possibly can, but just in case you do wonder why it's maybe not as much as usual, that's the reason. So it is 1988 and we are in Baiyin City. This was known to be quite a dusty, quiet place, the sort of place where you trusted everyone. You could leave your door unlocked or open at night if it was too hot in the summer. And devastatingly, this trust was something that these monsters like to take advantage of. Monsters like Gao. His first victim was 23-year-old Bai. She was just living her life. She was working, she was walking home this evening, maybe thinking about dinner, maybe thinking about a friend. She had a family, she had friends, she had people that absolutely loved her. And these were people who would never see her again. To anyone else who loved and adored her, she was this beautiful young woman filled with potential, filled with dreams. But to Gao, she was simply an opportunity. He stalked Bai for days on end, and it wasn't this kind of creepy guy with binoculars sort of vibe. He blended in. He made himself invisible. He just happened to be walking the same routes as Bai, following her route home, noting when she left work and when she would enter her home. He also timed how long it would take her to walk from her work to her home. And if she ever changed route, he would time that as well. Everything was meticulously planned with this monster. And then one night when Bai arrives home, when she is isolated by herself, this is when Gao would strike. Gao was able to force his way into Bai's apartment and she tried to fight him back. She tried to resist. She tried to keep him out. But devastatingly, despite this fight, despite everything that she was given in this situation, Gao was still able to overpower her. And then this brutal act of violence would take place. He would rape Bai, calculated and brutal. But he didn't stop there. He would stab her to death, and not only that, he would mutilate her body, and in particular, he would mutilate her genitals. He would focus on the reproductive organs, mutilate them, remove them, cut them off. And this would become his horrifying signature for the next 28 years. Think about it. This man is a shopkeeper. He is a quiet neighbour who would probably wave to you when you're walking down the street, and yet he was capable of unspeakable evil. And the thing with Gao, because he was so calculated, so methodical in his stalking, it made it less likely for any of these women to even stand a chance of survival. Because although it seemed random when these attacks happened, it wasn't randomness at all. This was all pre-planned. He carefully selected his victims and timed everything to his own advantage. Now police, they're called, but they arrived too late. For them, this looks like an isolated incident, a horrific one, but isolated nonetheless. When they're thinking about it, they say, you know what, it's probably just a one-off, it's probably not going to happen again. How you can come to that conclusion from such a horrific murder is beyond me, but, you know, police work at its best, apparently. Meanwhile, whilst this young woman's body is being found, is being observed and checked over by the police and a coroner, whilst a family is being notified that their loved one would never be seen again, Gao goes home to his wife. He helps make dinner. He talks to his kids. He brutally raped and murdered a young woman, and then he just vanishes back into this Family Guy mould that he's created. And he wasn't panicking, he wasn't messy, and above all, he was actually pleased with what he had done. He went home feeling satisfied. He felt on top of the world because he was like, I've executed my plan and no one knows it's me. I can do this and I can get away with it. This first murder validated this man. It told him, I could do this again if I want, and devastatingly he would. Now, Gao, although he is desperate to kill again, he knows that everything has to be perfect, and he would spend 6 years working out his next victim. Premeditated beyond belief, although I will say it is believed he had many more victims than what was found out, so it is possible he did kill in this time frame, but it could also be possible that he just had a very, very long cooling off period. So like I said, 6 years have gone by. It is now July of 1994 and he finds his next victim. This victim would be a 19-year-old woman by the name of Shir. Shir was a worker at a local power supply bureau in Baiyin, and like I said, she was only 19 years old. 19's barely an age. At this point, she should be figuring out what her career's going to be. She should be figuring out what she wants for dinner that night, thinking about the weekend, thinking about her friends, plans with her family, what shade of lipstick she should wear, possibly even having a quarter life crisis. But what Shir could never have imagined is that very evening, she would be walking into her own nightmare. Shir lived in a dormitory that was attached to her job, and this place was somewhere she was supposed to be safe. This was a place where she could rest, she trusted the people that she worked with, and really, they're the only people she should be seeing around here. There was loads of other young workers who were living in the same dormitory building, but Gao only had his sights set on one, and that was Shir. And on the night of July the 27th of 1994, he was able to slip into this dormitory when Shir was asleep. No one seen him. No one noticed him, and as you can probably imagine, he had been stalking Shir for weeks, watching her every move, learning and memorising her routine. And it's just horrifying what happens next. He wanders into the bedroom, he finds Shir asleep, and then he would launch this evil, sadistic attack. Shir would be stabbed over 36 times. And that's not a kill quick and get out quick. That's rage. That's control, that is sadism, and each and every single strike is complete overkill. And yet again for Gao, that wasn't enough. Now it was time for the mutilation, his signature. He would cut and tear and mutilate Shir's body while she lay there, completely degrading her even after she's gone. Now investigators, they did notice that there was a commonality between Shir and Bai. Now their bodies had been almost displayed in the sickest ways that you can imagine. They noticed that there seemed to be this kill, mutilate and display method that was used, but they still didn't link these crimes together. Hello? Like, is anyone inside these minds of these police officers? Like, lights on, no one's home. How the hell can you be like, oh my god, yeah, similarities they're there, but these are unrelated. Make it make sense. Not too long after Shir's murder, her body would be discovered by fellow co-workers. Could you imagine them walking into that? A friend, a co-worker, lying there, completely mutilated. How would someone ever recover from witnessing something like that? And of course, rumours, they spread quick. I mean, this was a 19-year-old girl who was butchered in her dormitory. People start whispering and saying, you know, we all need to be careful. There's a man out there who's targeting women. And just like always, Gao, by the time the police had arrived, by the time that Shir's body was found, he had vanished. No trace, no sign, nothing. The police had absolutely no leads. They have no idea who could be committing these crimes. They've not seen anything suspicious. They've not witnessed anyone suspicious. All they have is two young women brutally murdered in a very eerily similar way. And Gao, he has this thing in his mind where he's not seeing his victims as victims, he's seeing them as proof. Proof that he can do whatever he wants and get away with it. There would be 3 years that would pass after the murder of Shir. 3 years of silence. But Gao wasn't exactly dormant throughout this. He was simmering. He had an itch that he couldn't scratch in the way that we would. And this takes us to our next victim, a 23-year-old woman by the name of Lee. She was a young woman living in Baotou of Inner Mongolia, and Lee was someone who was just starting her life, early 20s, everything's coming into full function, life full of promises and possibilities. She had her own little apartment, her own little sacred space that she felt safe in. But as we know, safe spaces means nothing to Gao Chengyong. On March the 28th of 1997, Gao Chengyong, he would follow Lee back to her apartment. He was able to force his way in or either charm his way in. It's not completely known if he approached her as she was entering or whether he broke into the apartment. But once he was inside, either by force or by charm, a grim scene would take place that was basically replays of the previous murders. Now, it was very obvious with Lee's attack that this wasn't just about killing, it was about complete domination. Lee would be tied up, she was gagged, she was bound, and this is when Gao would finally carry out his sick, twisted and evil routine. He started off by sexually assaulting Lee, he raped her, and this time there was forensic evidence that was discovered, there was DNA left behind, but the forensic advancements within this region at this time, they weren't far along enough that they would be able to identify anyone. After this brutal assault had taken place, he then moves on to stabbing Lee, and he would stab her multiple times. It looked as though she had been attacked in various areas again and again and again, just plunging this knife into her. The attacks were almost clustered in vital areas, the areas that would inflict the most damage to make sure she wouldn't survive. And it was clear that this wasn't just about ending Lee's life, it was about punishment, dominance, control, degrading her and leaving a message to the wider public. Now, when Lee's body would be discovered, the investigators, they noted the telltale signs. Lower body exposed, bindings, multiple stab wounds. The echoes of Sher's case against Lee's case, they were impossible to ignore. And it's at this point where the police start thinking, you know what, maybe this isn't random after all, like maybe this is actually a murderer. Maybe this is a pattern and maybe there is actually a predator at large. No, Sherlock. But yet again, they are making moves in believing that there is a serial predator out there, but they still have no leads. Because Gao, he is still playing the invisible man so well. There's no witnesses, no cameras, no footprints leading anywhere. Just another young woman whose life was brutally ended. Now, for Gao within this, Lee's case, this was his escalation. Because he wasn't just killing now, he's refining his ritual. He's tying the victims up, he's sexually assaulting them, he's stabbing them, then he's mutilating their bodies. These are becoming his trademarks, what he is becoming known for. And it made him bolder. Because every single murder that he got away with, he grew more and more confident. And whilst investigators at this point, they're trying to connect the dots of these crimes, they're trying to figure it out. But Gao, he was calmly thinking about his next victim. Now, by 1998, Gao Chengyong, his killings, they would become more and more frequent. It was almost like there was this dam that had so much pressure on it that it finally burst, it finally gave way and it just overflowed. He went from years of silence to this sudden surge of brutality. And the first victim of this surge would be Yang, a 29-year-old woman living in Baiyin. And Yang, she wasn't a teenager, she wasn't this young early 20s student, she was an adult woman. She had her life together, she was working, independent, building her life. But to Gao, these details, they don't matter. He doesn't actually care what age they are as long as they're female. What mattered to Gao was her vulnerability. And Yang, the fact that she lived alone in her own apartment, to Gao, that made her vulnerable. Where we see independence, he's seen vulnerability. And I get it. I get that because she is alone, it does make her more vulnerable, but we don't think like that. So on the evening of January the 13th of 1998, Gao, he would slip into the home of Yang. He attacked her, very quickly overpowering her and being able to subdue her. The stabbing that took place was a savage, brutal attack, and by the time he had stopped, he had stabbed Yang over 30 times. This was mostly in the torso and the neck. And whilst this stabbing in itself is horrifying, this isn't even the part that horrified the investigators. It was the mutilation. Because Gao, although he had sexually mutilated her the way he did the previous victims, he had cut off her ears, he had removed a bit of her scalp. To him now, it wasn't just killing, it wasn't just about the control and domination, this was a collection, it was a ritual. The fact that this man brutally murdered this woman and then her lifeless body was laying there, and the only other thing he can think about is carving away pieces of her flesh. That is like different level of depraved. The scene where Yang was found was completely shocking and devastating to all investigators, and as with the previous cases, the rumours start going around at just how brutal this mutilation was. I mean, this was beyond all comprehension to the locals. And it wasn't just another killing, it was a message that this man is going to continue. And not only that, but he is going to escalate every single time. Only 6 days later, after the murder of Yang, Gao would strike again. The next victim was a woman by the name of Deng. She was 27 years old. She was also living in Baiyin. It's actually insane when you think about these sadistic evil monsters. I mean, most people can't even get their washing done in 6 days. And here he is, fitting 2 brutal, calculated sadistic murders into 6 days. So it's January the 19th of 1998 and Gao, he would enter the home of Deng. This attack, it did follow the same brutal patterns as the rest of them, the sudden attack, the stabbing, the domination, but the details that we have here, they're particularly grotesque. Deng had been stabbed multiple times, as we know and as we expect at this point. But yet again, what set this crime scene apart from the last was the mutilation carried out in a different way. Because Gao, he had actually bit off one of Deng's nipples. He literally tore away her nipple with his teeth. That's not just sadism, that is degradation on the most primal, animalistic level. And not only had this vile specimen, this monster, bit off her nipples, he had also carved parts of the flesh off of her back. Even to seasoned investigators, this crime scene, it was something out of nightmares. It's something that you hope and pray you never have to come across. This young woman has been carved in her own home, torn apart in her own home. And the horror was only amplified by how short a time frame there was between Yang's murder and Deng's murder. Now, by this point, the police, they're in complete panic mode. I mean, this is 2 murders in less than a week. Both young women mutilated in some of the most chilling ways that you could ever imagine. But for Gao, this was nothing to him. He went home to his family. Yet again, he's making dinner. He's helping his children with homework. After mutilating 2 young women, he is literally serving customers in his shop who come in and talk about these murders, come in and talk about how scared they are to live in a community where someone like this exists, all whilst knowing the monster among them is him. And as sickening and heartbreaking as these cases are, the next one doesn't get any easier, because Gao, he would target a 7-year-old child by the name of Yao. This was just a few months later. 7 years old, her whole life ahead of her whole future ahead of her. This little girl doesn't even know that evil like Gao exists. She was said to be full of potential. She was smart for her age. She was empathetic, and she had more humanity in her pinky finger. Tragically, she would become one of Gao's victims in July of 1998, and her murder, let's just say it escalated beyond what we already know, okay? There's the same thing. There's the attack, the stabbing, the sexual assault, and the mutilation. All of these murders chilled the community beyond belief, but to hear that a 7-year-old little girl could be attacked in the same horrendous, horrific, evil way, that terrified communities everywhere, because no one was safe. It wasn't just women that had to worry, it was any living, breathing female, because age wasn't something that this wild animal even cared about. Now we come to November the 30th of 1998, just a couple of months again after the murder of Yao. Now we come to November the 30th of 1998, which is just a couple of months after the brutal murder of Yao. And this is when Gao is really operating full throttle. His next victim was 23-year-old Sui, another young woman living in Baiyin. Sui's life, like many other of the victims, was incredibly ordinary in the best way. Life wasn't fancy, it wasn't flashy, but it was fulfilling. She had family, she had friends, she had a job. People in her life just adored her, no matter what capacity they knew her in. But this didn't matter to Gao. It didn't matter how loved you were or how cherished you were. It just mattered that you were female and that he had you in his sights. Gao would break into her apartment, where he very quickly overpowered her. And this assault followed his now standard methodology: rape, subjugation, and extreme violence. But the mutilation in this case is what takes it to an entirely different level. Because Gao, he removed her hands. Not an accident, not a slip, completely deliberate. He cut away both of her breasts and he mutilated her genitals in the sick, twisted, sadistic fashion that he has done with all his victims. Sway's murder shocked, terrified, and disturbed everyone. Investigators, even the most seasoned detectives, they were horrified. It was clear that the sheer audacity of the mutilation that this man was carrying out just kept escalating. The longer he was operating, the more brave, the more confident, the more sadistic he was becoming. He was very comfortable when it came to committing these crimes, and that was terrifying. There was women who were too afraid to leave their home, but these same women were also too afraid to stay in their home. Families were barricading doors, they were barricading single bedrooms within the house. They can't sleep, they can barely eat. And Gao just remained invisible, remained unremarkable, remained the friendly shopkeeper who promised you everything would be okay. And it still doesn't stop here, because just 2 years later, he would claim his 8th victim, 28-year-old Lau, and this horror just continued to escalate. So now it's July the 30th of 2000, 2 years after Sway's horrific murder, and a decade after he first started killing. And this guy's confidence was completely solidified. He wasn't scared. He wasn't worried that he might get caught. All he worried about was finding the next victim. On July the 30th, Lau would be unknowingly stalked by this evil specimen, this cretin, pathetic, weaselly loser. And as you can imagine, he had been stalking her quietly and secretly for weeks now. He knew her routine. He knew when she came, when she went, but he was just waiting for the perfect moment when she would be by herself so he could attack to his full potential. And once he found Lau alone, this is when he would strike, and he follows his same methodical pattern: the brutality, the domination, and the rape. Multiple stab wounds would be inflicted with precision and malice, and of course a mutilation. In this case again, Gao, he removes her hands, he mutilates her breasts, and he also mutilates her genitals. When investigators found Lau's body, they concluded, yet again, this is the same person. It is the same ritualistic styled killing, the same mutilation, the same assault. The pattern was unmistakable. The public was completely terrified. I mean, at this point, it's a city of whispers and locked doors, and then you have Gao, the one who is eerily calm, the one who knows that everything's going to be okay, that his family won't become a target because he's not targeting his own family. And if you think maybe that murder would be the end, then you're wrong. Think again, because we have yet another victim, a victim by the name of Zhang. She was only 27 years old and she would be murdered in 2001. Yet another case that would cement Gao's reputation as one of the most sadistic murderers in Chinese history. So it's May the 22nd of 2001, and this is the day that Gao decides he is going to attack Zhang. Zhang, like I said, 27 years old, she worked as a nurse. Her job was all about helping people. It's what she had dedicated her life to. It's what she dedicated every single day to. But yet again, Gao didn't care less. Gao stalked her. He learned her shift pattern, her routine. Of course, Zhang, being a nurse, she worked long, crazy hours. Gao waited for Zhang to finish one of her long shifts, and he followed her back to her apartment. When she's winding down for the evening, this is when he breaks in. This is when he attacks her. She would be tied up, she was sexually assaulted, she was stabbed, and she was mutilated. And we're really speeding up here because the very next day, May the 23rd, 2001, he would target his next victim, 21-year-old Chang. And yet again, like the rest, Chang's murder would follow the same pattern. Overpowered, tied up, gagged, raped, stabbed, and mutilated. The horror these young women went through is unfathomable, it's unimaginable, and I can't even think of the terror that they experienced in their final moments. Now we come to February the 5th, 2002, and Gao's last confirmed victim. This victim was 28-year-old Zhu. She was currently staying within a hotel. It was stated that Zhu was either visiting the city or she had travelled here for business when Gao would see her as another opportunity. Gao would stalk her throughout the city. He followed her back to her hotel, and when all was quiet, when no one was around, he would enter her hotel and he would attack her. He enters quietly and he enters when there is no witnesses around, and he is very aware that no one has seen him enter the hotel. He overpowers her, he binds her, he asserts his sick and twisted control. He would sexually assault her and then stab her multiple times, complete overkill yet again. And then he would mutilate her body. Investigators were now growing so completely impatient and so irritated. Why couldn't they catch the person who was capable of such sadistic murders? Why couldn't they solve this crime? And the public, they were equally as infuriated. Why were these police not doing their jobs? Why had this killer been operating for nearly 2 decades? By the early thousands, police, they've stacked files and papers and basically created the New York frickin' skyline with the amount that they've got, and yet they still had no name. And whilst they don't have any name, whilst they don't have any direct leads, they did do something worthwhile, and that was catalogue everything. Keep everything that was important, the DNA evidence, latent prints, biological traces. And then they had to wait patiently. They waited on science growing teeth, on science expanding. Because when better DNA testing came rolling in, they were waiting there with all the evidence to put through. And when DNA had started to elevate, when it was making waves, police, they were testing hundreds of people. They were testing hundreds of people's fingerprints, their DNA, and yet there's no matches. But they had a team who at this point, they were completely unwilling to drop the baton. They wanted to catch the sick freak. They had even announced a public reward of 2001. This was announced in 2004 when the police had sort of like formally linked all the murders together. Unfortunately, even announcing this award, it didn't bring much luck to the police. The case still wasn't being solved, but the pressure was high. So then 2016 happened, right? And a relative that had the same surname as Gao, they would be picked up on an unrelated economic bribery case. So routine testing is carried out, and this routine testing flagged a Y chromosome that was uncomfortably similar to that of the serial killers. It wasn't a direct match, but it was a familial one. So this is when investigators, they start getting tactical. They decide, let's bulk out this family tree. Let's take a little walk down memory lane and see if there's anyone that sticks out. So they're mapping out the Gao clan. So they are going by ages. They're cross-referencing who could have been in the area of Baiyin and Baotou when these murders were taking place. So they're looking, flicking through, going down the family tree, and they come to Gao Chengyong. And when they get to his name, he gets a little red circle put around it. Because this middle-aged grocer, this quiet, polite, friendly face within the neighbourhood, he fit the early behavioural pattern a bit too closely. And this is when the stalker becomes the stalkee, right? Because investigators, they're like, we're not going to go in right away. We need cold, hard evidence, something that helps our case. So they stalk Gao. They follow his routine, they follow him to work, they follow him after hours, they observe him, they see who he's watching, where his eyes go, how he interacts with customers. And then they decide, let's get some DNA and fingerprints. Obviously Gao works in his grocers, so he is touching items, throwing items out in the bin, and the investigators, they go in and they take some of these items. So they've got fresh fingerprints, they've got DNA, they head back to the lab, send it through for testing, and then the latent prints that they had from, nearly 3 decades, they finally align. And this is the moment where this case stopped being a story and finally became paperwork. So on August the 26th of 2016, bearing in mind he started killing in 1988, it is now 2016. Police officers, they would walk into the unremarkable grocery store and they would arrest Gao Chengyong. It was nothing flashy, there was no fireworks, there was no police chase, just the end of a very, very long sentence. Neighbours watched and stared as Gao was taken out of his shop. They were horrified. Half of them just had blank expressions. They couldn't believe this polite, kind guy could be capable of something so heinous. Surely they've got the wrong guy. It couldn't be Gao. Gao barely even talks, let alone murder people. But when Gao was faced with the DNA, the fingerprint matches, he knew that his reign of terror was finally up. He can't run from this now. And he would confess to all 11 murders, spanning from 1988 all the way to 2002. And after 16 years of horrifying terror, after what he put a whole community through, Gao would finally find himself in a place that he could not charm his way out of, and that was a court in Gansu province. And unlike the apartments and riverbanks that he had once targeted, this stage that he was now on was completely lit up. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, journalists, and officials all staring down at this man who was once invisible. Now, court trials in China, they're known to be efficient. Some even deem them to be brutally efficient. But Gao, he would face proceedings in 2018, less than 2 years after his arrest. And let's just say they weren't holding back. He was formally accused of 11 murders, 11 rapes, and 11 cases of desecration of a corpse. Basically, if there's a category for evil, this lowlife, he ticks every single one. So we've got Gao, who is 54. He shuffles his way into the courtroom. He's wearing his little orange prison jumpsuit, and he is noticeably thinner than the mugshot that I've probably shown you already. His shoulders were hunched, his hands were cuffed, and his face was completely blank. There was not a single look of remorse on this monster's face. Now, as you can imagine, there is a heaviness in this courtroom. This is 11 victims, 11 different families who all want to say their case, who all want to stand there and get justice for their victims. Relatives would openly cry, some even shouted. One of the victims' dads, they actually had to be restrained because they tried to go for Gao. And even when this took place, even when he has a man running toward him, a man who could probably get the better of him if the police turned a blind eye, but he just sat staring forward, completely expressionless. He couldn't have given a tiny rat's ass what was going on. Now, the prosecution, they laid out this case plain and simple. They say he wasn't a man that had snapped. He wasn't a man who was drunk or high or was driven by a sudden rage. He was calculated, he was methodical, and he was ritualistic. The prosecution would then detail what had happened to these young women and the young child, the mutilations, the rapes, the brutal attacks. And they told the courtroom this wasn't just killings, this wasn't just murders, this was complete sadism. He preyed on women and evidently young children who were deemed to be vulnerable, who were alone, who might have been isolated. And listen, when it came to his defence, I mean, they tried, bless their soulless little hearts, they tried. They had argued that, well, Gao had confessed and he had cooperated with police, so surely there should be some leniency. And I know that these people have a job to do, right? I get it, but I don't know how they do it. I could not do it. I could not defend a man who mutilated 11 young women and a 7-year-old girl, who raped them, tortured them, and brutally attacked them. You're not going to see me up there. If anything, I'm hoping that you fry. I will say, when the defence, they were given their case of, he should get leniency, he cooperated, the judge did not look impressed. They were not amused. And the prosecution swept in right away, and they were like, just because he cooperated after 28 years of silence does not mean he gets leniency. He cooperated because he had to, because the evidence was in black and white, smushed in his face. The only thing that proves for certain is that when this monster gets cornered, he gets scared and he starts to confess. Now, forensic psychiatrists, they would be brought in and they had given sort of like a review of Gao. They said that he suffered from paraphilic disorder, which is sexual arousal that is linked to violence. Not only that, but domination and suffering. He was stated to be compulsively homicidal, but he was not insane. He knew right from wrong, he knew what he was doing, and he planned it all. This means that there was no mental illness shield that they could use for Gao. He wasn't a delusional madman, he was a sadist that had patience beyond any measure. Victims' family members, they got to say their statements in court, give their victim impact statements, and they were honestly heartbreaking. I do not know how people get the courage to go up in court and say what they need to say. It's inspiring, but also horrifying that they even have to do that in the first place. But families, they were crying. I mean, they were relieved that there was going to be some sort of justice, but they've spent, some of them, 28 years wondering what happened to their loved one, wondering who did this to them. Now, some of the victims' relatives, they referred to Gao as a monster. They spat on him, which, haha. One of the family members had demanded that he get the death penalty and that he doesn't deserve to see another sunrise, which, absolutely, I agree with 100%. And whilst these families are baring their souls in this public court, Gao, yet again, doesn't care, doesn't flinch, doesn't shed a tear, not that we would expect him to, but there was no emotional reaction from him that would say, I regret what I've done. By March of 2018, the court, they had heard enough. They didn't need any more information relating to Gao Chengyong. They knew where he stood. And Gao Chengyong, he would be convicted on all counts. The rapes, the murders, the robberies, the desecration of corpses. And what sentence did he get? Death. The death penalty. Absolutely. The judge said that he was extremely cruel and also a despicable person, which is the polite way of saying, you're the stuff of nightmares and we need you taken off this planet ASAP. And you might be wondering, Anna, what happened to his wife, to the children? Something that doesn't really get discussed much. I mean, they sat at a dinner table with this man. They gave him hugs. His wife, can't say for certain, but probably had sex with him at some point when he was committing these murders. All whilst having no idea what this monster was capable of. Now, as soon as he was arrested, his wife filed and got a divorce. His children, who had grown up by then, they had completely cut ties with him and fell off the radar. They were so ashamed to even be associated with this man. They basically hide themselves. So then on January the 3rd of 2019, less than 1 year after his sentencing, Gao would be executed via lethal injection. And there was no grand speeches, he wasn't given any opportunities, it was just clinical finality. A small news report that would confirm his death, but the media, people of the town, they didn't drag it out, they didn't make it something sensationalised, they wanted it to be him gone, deceased, deleted from the earth, goodbye Gao, and that's it. And whilst this takes a monster off the streets, it takes a monster out of the community for the families who lost someone, there is no erasing that. They spent decades in agonising emotional pain, hoping that one day, this day would come, the day where this monster would be found. And for them, his execution, it wasn't closure like everyone thought it would be. It was just the end of a very, very, very long nightmare. Or at least of the nightmare's villain. Because for every day for the rest of their life, they have to endure some sort of nightmare by knowing that their loved one isn't here anymore. And Gao, this man who thought he was invisible, who thought he was this great monster, who thought he was the perfect serial predator, all he is now is a headline, if that. He's just another statistic, another criminal profile, another weirdo for us to just drag through the mud. And whilst this monster might be erased, he might have been deleted like a spam email, right? To the people of Baiyin and Baotu, this isn't the case. His actions echo. People are still afraid because if one person like that exists, surely another could too. Daughters were dragged everywhere by their parents. Parents didn't want their daughters out of their sight. Locals from that time still remember the fear that was constantly felt. Some people within the community still feel as though when they step outside on a sunny morning, are they signing their death warrant just by going outdoors? Now, the capture of Gao, this would change things on a national level as well. His arrest was one of the very first high-profile cases within China to be solved via familial DNA. So Chinese authorities, they noticed this and they pushed for more genetic databases. Many people in China have argued that the government's want for these genetic databases is another way to have Big Brother's eye on them. But the case of Gao, it shows that, you know, this does work, whether you like it or not. Now, as always, this case today, it is dedicated to the victims and the victims' families. Because for them, there is no happy ending. The mothers, daughters, sisters, aunties, they don't return just because Gao was executed. Some families have continued to suffer greatly. Some have become reclusive through shame and grief, things that they should not feel. Others turned their pain outward, speaking to the public about the need for awareness and safety. But sadly in China, that kind of advocacy, it seems to have its limits. So instead, most of the grief lives quietly within a home, within four walls, with pictures of lost daughters hanging on them. And whilst photos might collect dust, these victims will never be forgotten. But my loves, that is it for this true crime and makeup episode. I really hope I did this one justice. It was quite a new case to me, so I'm hoping it was new to some of you as well. If you do enjoy my content, please, 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 please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Share the video if you feel obliged, if you enjoy my work. Any details you need regarding me, myself and I, they will all be listed down below in the description for you, alongside any product details used on my face today. Don't forget you can leave your case suggestions in the comments down below. But I think that's it for today. So on that note, please, please, please remember, be a good person, do not be a bad person, stay safe, look after each other, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!